Welcome back to Compass, Finding Spirituality in the Everyday. I'm your host, Ryan Dunn, and this episode explores themes of growth, faith, and resilience. This episode releases on July 10th, 2024. And as we're releasing this, we're having issues with our RSS feed. The RSS feed is how the episode actually reaches your ears. So this episode will initially only be available on some podcast platforms, and you may have already noticed other episodes are missing from those platforms as well. So as I speak, our team is working really hard to get the issue resolved, and hopefully we'll be back with having the full slate of Compass episodes available everywhere very soon. For this episode, we're joined by Reverend David Livingston, who brings a wealth of wisdom from his pastoral experiences and his personal journey through life's challenges, including in this episode a poignant story of his mother's battle with cancer. Also in this episode, we'll explore the transformative power of journaling, prayer, and meditation as tools for spiritual connection and for coping with grief. David shares how setting boundaries, and this is something I needed to learn, and practicing self-care can sustain emotional and spiritual health. We also tackle the tough questions about anxiety and faith, discussing how anxiety is a biological process and reframing biblical commands to foster inner peace. There's also a little nugget of a Bible reading plan embedded in this episode, so listen for that. And with that, here we go. Pastor David, thank you so much for joining us. How goes it with your soul today?
It's a good day today. Talking about some new ministry possibilities in a nearby city and having a good time. How are you?
Yeah. All right. I'm doing very well too. I always get excited when people start talking about new ministry possibilities because it's one of the areas that I cover. Are you able to disclose anything about what you're working on?
Some partnerships. I really can't. It's too early, but yeah, a nearby city that has some good options, good possibilities.
Cool. Well, we are talking about possibility in life and kind of inspiring some hope today. We're basing this conversation out of your book, Getting to Good. And part of the book draws from this promise that Jesus gives that through him, people can encounter life abundantly, or this promise of abundant life. How do you define abundant life? What is he talking about there?
Yeah, that's a good question. And of course, that comes from John. I think there's a couple of different ways that people usually will do that. A lot of people will talk about that as being this only a abundant life in the hereafter, I think we'll say. And is that a promise about eternity, not about this life? And I think there's truth to that. But at the same time, in the Gospels, we find Jesus healing people who are sick, giving food to people who are hungry. I don't think it's the case that Jesus wants us to be, or that God wants us to be impoverished in this world. And on the other hand, there's also people who will take a prosperity gospel approach to that and say, well, that abundant life, that justifies me having a private plane or whatever it might be. And I think that's a kind of false gospel. But I think that abundant life is about both an eternal life as well as a here and a now kind of life, but not like a get-rich-quick scheme that prosperity gospel seems to be. Not that if you're faithful, life will be perfect kind of thing. We know that's not true. So I think for me, abundant life has to do with something that happens in this life, but is not based on material well-being. It means a kind of a spiritual and emotional well-being. And so that's really what the book is about. Given the reality that we don't have perfect lives, how can we find ways in the real world issues that we have that impact our spiritual well-being that we can find some peace in the midst of that?
So what are some characteristics of abundant life in your own experience? Like, what do you look at in your life and say, well, these are some of the marks that I see that I'm encountering or experiencing an abundant life that Jesus was referencing?
So I think an example for me would be the second chapter of the book. I talk about anxiety, and I use some personal examples of where anxiety really had a full grip on me with panic attacks, and um, um, I don't go into too much detail, but the truth is that those panic attacks for me had become fairly debilitating. And so it's not the case that now all of a sudden, because I know Jesus, the anxiety is gone, right?
Yeah.
That's still a real piece. But there is at the same time, there is such a thing as the peace that surpasses understanding. And in the midst of what still is a stressful environment, there's and we might talk about this some later on, but there is an ability, I think, to have um, a cognizance that even though the world is hard right now, there will be a time when that's not the case, and so that gives you a spiritual, or for me at least, can give me a spiritual peace of mind that I otherwise might not have. There's a chapter about getting to good with bad, and the truth is, bad things happen. Does that mean that God is absent, or can we find ways that God's present even in the bad that happens? Aging. My birthday was yesterday. I'm 51 now.
Oh, congrats.
Um, at 51, that felt a little bit different than just 50 for some reason for me. I don't know why. But in the aging process, what's it look like to be able to be in a better place with the physical changes that happen for us, the maturity changes that happen for us?
I go back, and I appreciate you sharing authentically about your experience with anxiety and experiencing panic attacks. Anxiety, well, we all encounter it. Some of us far more deeply than others. As you were going through periods of anxiety that led to panic attacks, was there like an internal dialogue that called into question your faith in a way that, oh, well, I can't settle down, or I can't settle my mind because I just don't have enough faith? Was that part of what was driving some of that anxiety for you?
Yeah, I don't know if it was driving the anxiety, but it certainly wasn't helping it go away.
Yeah. Okay.
And in the book, I mean, I addressed that pretty point blank in the Beatitudes. Jesus says, consider the lilies. Everybody knows that, right? And the lilies, why would you be anxious? He says. In fact, he says, do not be anxious. When I was in the throes of real panic and real anxiety issues, the single least helpful thing for somebody to say to me would be, well, just stop it. Don't be anxious.
Right. Yeah. Don't worry. Yeah. So often we throw that verse around like, oh, just don't worry. Like, oh,
Exactly.
oh, it's just that simple, right?
And so
Not
it's
at
just,
all.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, and there's a really common idea that if you just have more faith, you won't worry, you won't have anxiety, you won't have fear. And that's just not true. I mean, for one thing, that's not how our bodies work. Like, nobody makes a decision. There's a decision component to faith, but nobody makes a decision. Now I will be anxious. Now I will be fearful, right? So that's just not how it works. So one of the things that was helpful for me specifically with that verse is the idea of reframing that language. It comes across as a command. Grammatically, it's a command. Do not be worried. Do not be anxious. That's a command kind of language, an imperative. But I don't believe that's the way that Jesus actually intended for that to be heard. I use an example from back in my childhood when I was scared of thunderstorms. I was scared of the dark. I was scared of lots of stuff when I was a kid. I would call out for my mom, and my faithful mom would always come to my bed, and she would sit down. What I remember is her sitting down and rubbing my back to help calm me down, and she would say something like, "Don't be afraid. Don't be anxious. I'm right down the hall, or I'm right downstairs. It's going to be okay." What I'm able to think back on that now as is that when my mom is sitting on my bed, rubbing my back and saying, "Don't be afraid, don't be anxious." If I had said, "But I am anxious," she wouldn't say back to me, "David, I said, don't be anxious," right? It's not an order, it's permission. You don't have to be anxious. Maybe you are, and it's okay if you are. but you don't have to be, because it's going to be, trust me, that it's going to be okay. And so now I hear for myself in those moments, I should say, a small dose of medication prescribed appropriately by a doctor is a fantastic gift from God and has helped me tremendously in my own anxiety.
Uh,
But when I do have some of those more anxious moments, though, I'm able to go back and say, you know what? It's okay. It's okay to be anxious. It's not a lack of faith. It's a biological process, a biochemical process. And it's not sinful. It's not a lack of faith. And I have permission to be anxious, but I also have permission not to be anxious.
So as a child, you had this very physical experience of your mother consoling you. Are there some ways now that you're able to kind of provide a practical experience where you get the same kind of consolation through your faith? Like, is there a spiritual practice that you employ that maybe helps keep you from cycling down or spiraling down into a deep, anxious moment that leads to panic?
Well, I think there's a psychological piece there, and that what works for one person may not work for somebody else too as well. But what I do know, the biochemical, like those anxious moments, there is real chemistry that's happening there. So that your body, when you feel anxious, your body feels threatened, and you can't turn it off any less than if there's a bear standing right in front of you, threatening you physically, and the bear is a real physical threat. Your body treats it like a real physical threat. And I want to be careful about over spiritualizing it and saying, like if there was a bear standing in front of you, I would encourage people not to just pray to God, God, help this bear not kill me, right? You need to take a physical step in that regard. So for me, for anxiety, meditating is helpful. Just laying down is helpful. Finding a quiet spot is helpful. Reminding myself, you don't want to focus too much on the anxiety, but it's okay to acknowledge. Don't deny it. Don't try to make yourself not anxious, because that'll just cause the cycle.
Yeah, it snowballs.
Yeah. So I don't want to over spiritualize it, but because it is a physical reaction. But whatever you can do to quiet your soul, whatever you can do to quiet your body. In the book, one practice I recommend is a breath prayer. You breathe in a word that you use for God. Breathe out what it is that you need from God. So, Jesus, calm my soul. Jesus, calm my soul would be one example of how that can work.
It's funny, as you were speaking through that, I started breathing a little bit like that myself and feeling a little bit more relaxed in the moment. Yeah. One of the things that keeps me from spiraling down into deep episodes of anxiety is putting things in their right place, so to speak. So, and for me, that means compartmentalizing or putting boundaries around things like work. And that's not something that I've always had a healthy relationship with. And I think in our society, a lot of people fall into this mode of thinking where, work can be life, or this other aspect can be life. I know when I was working as a youth minister, I was recruiting a volunteer who had been a former youth minister. And he ended up saying no as a volunteer. He said, because when I was in youth ministry, I had an affair with my job. And I thought that sounded kind of silly at the time, until a year later, I realized that I was on the verge of doing the same thing. Like I could not say no. I would be like, well, hey, I've only got 4 meetings at night this week. I can fill up that 5th or 6th night. That's fine. Yeah. And that's very unhealthy. Can you elaborate on how setting boundaries has put some perspective and health into your spiritual life and emotional life?
Yeah. Well, and that's an interesting metaphor, because I spend most of the time when I talk about boundaries, thinking about boundaries between people. But the way that you talked about that as an affair, our jobs can be like that other person, or the church organization can be like that other person. And so that really is a helpful way to think about it. And thinking about your priorities. So are you putting a spouse ahead of? And one of the things that's important, which we miss, so the great commandment, Matthew 22, loving God with all of our heart, soul, strength, and mind, loving our neighbor as ourselves. I think I said Matthew 22. I think it's actually Matthew 20. But anyway, um, I think about that usually as two commandments, right? And Jesus says it that way, really. But there's two commandments. One is to love God. The other one is to love neighbor. That's how we often will talk about it. But there's a hidden third commandment in there too. So love God is a commandment,
Yeah.
and then love neighbor is a commandment. But what's it say about loving your neighbor? How do you love your neighbor?
Oh,
You love your
as you
neighbor
might
as
love yourself.
yourself. And so if you don't set boundaries for yourself, number one, nobody else is going to, right?
Mm.
There's not been a time in the history of the church when somebody has said to a volunteer at the church or a staff person at the church, here's something that we really need to have somebody do, and you're not going to do it because you have to take care of yourself instead. Like, we don't do that. When we have a
Mm-mm.
volunteer, we're like, fantastic, we've got a volunteer.
Yeah.
So, what's that mean about loving yourself? Are you really loving yourself if you never put yourself first? And so what I suggest to people is, I don't think it's healthy for us to put ourselves ahead of other people, but we don't put ourselves behind other people either. You're worth just as much, Ryan, as the organization that you work for. You're worth just as much as the other person who wants to manipulate your time. And so there's kind of, to be cliche, there's a little bit of that whole put your oxygen mask on first before the child that you're sitting next to in the airplane. You have to take care of yourself, and setting those boundaries is one of the ways that you can do that. Go ahead.
I was just thinking, you're in a profession that it demands quite a bit as a lead pastor of a church. You probably, in most days, feeling like there's a little bit more that you could have been, that you could have
Always.
done, and carrying some guilt with that. So how do you practice this self-care that you're that you're that you're asking us for within your own life? Like, what kind of boundaries do you have around your work life schedule?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one of the things that's become really important for me is to remember that there's a lot of areas where if I do something, as senior pastor in particular, if I do something, then that means that somebody else will not be able to do that. Um, if if there's anybody else who can do something, it's good for me to delegate to that person from a professional standpoint. Even from a personal standpoint, if we've got, well, one thing that we've done here, we had a habit when we handed out third grade Bibles. We have at this church, the practice has been that individuals can basically like sponsor that Bible. They'll pay for that. They can leave a message for the student in that. And we had, when I arrived, a number of staff who would really quickly have somebody who they wanted to sponsor that Bible for. So we stopped that, because those kids already know, hopefully, that the staff are there for them. But when we do that, then we prevent somebody else from being able to do that. So one of the things that happens when I'm able to say no is that allows somebody else to say yes, who needs to say yes more than what I need to do for myself. Another piece for that for me, and this may be more as a pastor, I'm not sure if this will be a great answer or not for people who are in other kinds of roles in life, but it's okay for people to fail. God doesn't judge us when we fail, right? And God doesn't judge other people when they fail too. So we had a situation just recently here at the church where I had to make a decision for myself. Is this particular piece so important that it absolutely has to happen? And in order for it to happen, I have to step in personally to make sure it happens. Or would it be okay for us to learn a lesson by having this fail, and then we learn something valuable, and we can pick up the pieces, and we can move on as a church? Or sometimes things just need to die, and that's okay too.
Mm.
But if we always are saving, like, you don't have to be the savior for everything. You're not supposed to,
Yeah.
right? We have a savior already.
Yeah. Well, we fall into that as parents all the time too, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And like the best choices as a parent, the best choices that we've made, I think, are when we've chosen, Tracy and I, to not step in and to let it's better from a parenting standpoint, it's better to let a child fail when they're younger and the stakes are not as high. And so sometimes in the church and in other places of life, we artificially elevate the stakes. So like, I talk about this in a different section of the book, but we catastrophize sometimes. Like we decide, okay, what's the absolute worst thing that's going to that could happen, and that's what's going to happen, and almost always that's not the case. If you don't have this was not what we were dealing with, but if you don't have the nursery one Sunday because you don't have the volunteers to run the nursery one Sunday, what's the worst thing that's going to happen? You're going to have some extra noise in the sanctuary. The noise of kids in the sanctuary is great anyway. It's okay if that doesn't happen one week. And then maybe the church has learned a lesson that, wow, if we don't have our volunteers, we really can't make this happen. And that's a good lesson for us to learn. Yeah.
Do you think God does that to us individually?
I think sometimes so. One of the harder parts of this book is a section called Getting to Good with Bad. And that's, again, part of our reality is that we live in a world where bad things happen. So the question, why? And some people would disagree with me, but I think that there are times when there's times when bad things happen because of the choices that I make. There's sometimes bad things happen because of the choices others make that affect me. I think sometimes there's bad things that happen because God does not miraculously step in to intervene and allow something to happen, iron sharpening iron, to use a biblical language. But again, not when we're talking about some of those most critical moments of our life, either our present life or our eternal life.
I feel comfortable asking this question because I feel like you've probably answered this question a few times over your tenure as a professional minister. Where do you get a sense God is moving in those instances when it's not a personal decision that causes bad things to happen, but bad things are just inflicted upon people? Say like a natural disaster or we can go as far to say Palestinian people in Gaza. Where is God moving in that?
Yeah, those are the harder ones, something like a natural disaster in particular, because it's hard to pin the blame for that on a person or a group of people's sin, right? You can't say an earthquake happened, well, or at least most of us would not say an earthquake happened because of...
True, yeah. There are those voices out there who have said that. And so, a little off base.
A couple of things that for me are really, really important about that. One is there's a passage, Romans 8:28, and the particular translation that works for me with this is the New International Version. One of the ways that other versions say this verse is, all things work together for good for those who love God. And I find that not to be the case. I remember listening to a radio show years and years ago, and it was a Christian radio show, and the host brought on a couple, and the couple was talking about their experience. They really wanted kids. They weren't getting pregnant. Finally, they got pregnant, and they were just rejoicing in that, grateful to God for that, and then they had a miscarriage.
Yeah.
And then the host says, and you knew that God was at work in that, right? And that there was going to be good that comes from this. And they're like, yeah. And then they had another miscarriage. And then I think they had a child that was born and then died in infancy. I mean, like, it was a horrible story. The host just keeps saying, and you know that this is still part of God's plan. I don't think that's part of God's plan. But here's the other way, and this is how the NIV does it. The other translation for that verse is, all things, God works for the good. And that, I believe, in all things, it doesn't mean that all things are good.
Yeah, or that there's a divine plan behind all things, yes.
Or that, So I think about it I think about our lives kind of like a book. I guess I'm a reader and I'm a writer. So I think about it like a book. And we know what the chapters of the book are in our lives up until this point. And then what lies ahead is a mystery. That part of the book isn't written yet, or at least we haven't seen it, except we do know the last chapter. So we know how the book ends. And in any good book, any good movie, there's going to be conflict, right? That's part of conflict as a literary device. Not necessarily conflict between two people, but there's got to be stakes, right?
Yeah.
There's going to be twists and turns. There's going to be plot twists, but we know how the last chapter ends. And so for me, from a faith standpoint, that helps me a lot in those moments. My mom, the book is dedicated to my mom. She died in 2021. She always wanted me to write a book. And so, so I'm grateful that I've been able to write that book. But she died in 2021 from cancer. And what was the cause of the cancer? I don't think anybody knows. Would it matter? No. She died either way. But I also know that's not through faith, that's not the end of her story. And that's not the end of my relationship with her. And that's the last chapter. So what happens between now and then? I didn't know in 2021 when she died that in 2023 I would start working on a book and have it published in 2024. That becomes part of the story as we go along. So we get to live that story with some unpredictability until we get to that last chapter and then have the resolution.
How do you stay grounded in that hopefulness? So you've shared this very personal story. I'm sure that in 2021, as your mother was going through her end of life experience, there were probably moments when you were questioning, how could something good come out of this? Are there ways that you kind of keep yourself grounded then in a mindset of hope? Are there practices that you utilize?
Yeah, I mean, you don't always see it. One of the things that's really helpful, and a lot of people have, of all kinds of traditions have done this, but one of the things that can be really helpful is journaling. Because when you journal, when you actually write those pieces down, some people do that as a prayer practice. They'll journal prayers. That can be very helpful. But even just as a diary, that can be helpful because then you can look back. Pastorally, I've been a pastor for 25 years and 26 years, I guess now. And so I've been around cancer a lot, but my mom's death was the first parent who died. And so I could always be next to somebody as they're dealing with death, but now I know what it means to have a parent die. So I'm a better pastor now than what I was prior to my mom's death in the fall of 2021. I didn't know that until after that experience happened. And until I worked through some of the grief from that experience happening too, for that matter. So I only know that in retrospect. And I think that's usually what happens for us when we're in those really difficult points in life. So we can remind ourselves in the moment about that Romans 8:28. We can remind ourselves there will be some way in which some kind of good it doesn't always make up for the bad, like it's still a bad thing, but there'll be some form of redemption in this. There'll be some kind of good that comes. We can think about that at the time, and that's good to do at the time. Just know that you're not really going to fully see it until after the fact at some point. And then you'll be able to look back retrospectively. Again, using the book metaphors, foreshadowing is a great literary device. Sometimes you don't recognize the foreshadowing that the author has been using until after that event that was being foreshadowed takes place. And then you can say, that's why back in chapter 3, the author said such and such, because now that I'm in chapter 8, something particular has happened. So, again, I think it's important for us to just acknowledge the reality about that life is hard. And there are moments when we can't understand. And in some cases, it won't be until that last chapter. And there is a way in which that's the place where faith really does have to enter in for us to believe that the end of the story is going to be okay.
Pastor, there's somebody listening who is probably thinking I love what you're talking about, and yet in my experience, I feel so far from God, whether that means that I just haven't been a part of a church in a long time, or I'm feeling some kind of religious trauma, and the baggage for that has kept me away. How are some ways that they might start to move towards a sense of spiritual connection or spiritual renewal?
Yeah, so that journaling practice, again, is one of the ways that people have a lot of, depending on your personality and what really feeds you, can be one of the ways that you see that. Again, with the idea that you go back and then see, in retrospect, what God was doing. The prayer practice we talked about before, the breath prayer, is one of the things that a lot of people find can be really helpful. There's a way in which, for a lot of, you have to practice it in order to believe it. Sometimes believing is seen, and to get to the believing point, you have to do the practice. Adam Hamilton has told this story about his wife, and a point coming where he was kind of, and from his perspective, falling out of love with her, and just wasn't sure they were going to have a future together. And then his pastor at the time said, you should go buy her some flowers. And so he did. And the advice was every day, buy her some flowers. And he did. And he was buying her flowers, not because he loved her, but he was buying her flowers because he was told, you should do this. So he did it. But then eventually he found that he was buying her flowers because he loved her. The practice enabled him to have that experience again of falling in love. So many of the traditional Christian practices that we have as means of grace in the Wesleyan tradition would fit into that category. So, even if you don't feel like praying, pray. Even if you don't feel like reading the Bible, read some of the Bible. I tell people, by the way, with Bible reading, don't follow any of those read the Bible in a year plans. But then you start to get to the point where you're like to the point where, well, I'm reading the Bible because I'm supposed to read the Bible, and I gotta get through this many chapters if I'm going to stay on my track.
Oh,
Don't do that. Read a chapter a day, or read just a section, and then stop when you get the message that God wants to convey to you that day. Then stop and allow that message to sink in, instead of forcing yourself to just read more for the sake of reading more and getting your task done. I'm a task person, so for me, like, there's a part of me that's like, in fact, I have on my to-do list for each day is to read my Bible. And then I read it and I can check it off. But it's important for me not to read it so that I can check it off, right? A good devotional book, there's many of them that are out there, having a discipline like that in the morning or at nighttime, doing that practice regularly until, again, you start to do that because you want to do that, not because your to-do list says that it's to be done. Works of mercy, I mean, you find God when you're in service to somebody else. And I always tell folks that, for example, on a mission trip, people will come back from a mission trip and they'll say, I got more out of this than the people who I served.
Yeah.
And I think that's true. And there's a biblical basis for that in Matthew's gospel too, where Jesus says, as you've done it to the least of these, you've done it to me. So you really encounter the divine, I believe, when you help another person who's in need.
Yeah. So often as I think about my own experience, like those kind of mountaintop spiritual experiences were those moments of stepping into a place of need where I didn't even know, what my role was there. And yet just kind of that presence is what made it.
Yeah. And I think there's an emptiness to our faith when people, like, showing up at a church on Sunday morning doesn't make you a Christian.
Yeah.
Right.
For sure.
So the faith has to be lived out, and that develops our faith as well. So
but this may be our final question, and I'm just kind of curious. So knowing what you know now, and having read as much of the Bible as you have read, if somebody is saying, well, I've got a Bible at home, a little bit dusty, if I'm going to blow off the cobwebs and such and start reading, what might be a good book to start with?
Just if you're reading the Bible, what I suggest to people, if you want to read through the whole Bible, we'll say what I suggest to people is that you start with the Gospel of Luke. And if you're opening up a Bible for the first time, if you open it up to the middle, it's going to be Psalms. And then if you open it up to the middle again, it'll be one of the Gospels. Flip to Luke, which is Gospel number 3. The 4th Gospel is John. Skip John, and then read Acts. And the reason for that is because the same author wrote both. So
okay,
you can read all of that, Luke and Acts, as one narrative, and then go back to read Matthew, Mark, and John, the rest of the New Testament, and then go back to read the whole Bible from start to finish. So I always suggest it that way because you've got the main character is Jesus, but he doesn't show up until 2/3 of the way through.
Yeah,
if you just read from start to finish. So I think
it's a lot of prologue. Yeah,
yeah, that's right. That's how I suggest people start to read the Bible. And again, just with the understanding that you can take your lifetime to read through it. I don't care. Don't do it in a month. Don't do it in a year. I mean, if you really get into it, that's okay, but don't do it in a set period of time. Take your time with it.
Well,
I want to go back to can I go back to one more thing though?
Absolutely.
Your last question. This may not address it exactly, but I think one of the things that's so important is as we think about our relationship with God, I find a lot of people who sometimes I'll say this in worship. We don't really need to talk that much about our shortcomings. In my experience, we don't really need to talk that much about the things that we've done that are bad because I'm self-aware. I know most of the places where I've screwed up. You probably, Ryan, have the same thing yourself, right? So
yeah, and we sometimes have a tendency to dwell on that too.
Absolutely, yeah. We all know that we fall short of what God would want. Many of us have a hard time forgiving ourselves for those, and so I think sometimes about the people who might have an experience where I hear the pastor talking about God as love, and that's for other people because the pastor doesn't know what I've done.
Yeah,
and for me, one of the most important stories, my favorite chapter in the book is the last chapter, which is about forgiving ourselves. And it walks through the story of Peter in John's gospel. And I won't share too much of it because I want people to read it for themselves and to have the discovery themselves. But, we think about Judas as sort of the bad guy of the gospels, and he is. But Peter's not all that much better. I mean, Peter's a mess. In the Gospel of John, Peter also with Jesus comes around full circle, and you cannot, if you're reading the Gospel of John for all it's worth, you cannot finish reading it and say, okay, God, I've done too many bad things for God to love me. Peter's story kind of frames the gospel with a story of redemption that a lot of us miss. And so whoever you are, whatever you've done, whatever you will plan on doing, I believe the Bible when it says nothing can separate us from the love of God through Jesus Christ our Lord. I think for me that's just a fundamental truth that is really important for all of us to remember. Nothing can separate us from the love of God through Jesus Christ.
Amen. You know how to bring the plane in for a landing. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. It's great to talk with you, Ryan.
Likewise. Appreciate your time.
Absolutely.
All right.
Listener, thank you for joining us on this episode of Compass alongside Reverend David Livingston. I want to thank the team that helps make Compass possible. Lane Denson does the technical development. Patty Delabovi takes care of marketing. There's a whole team of people at United Methodist Communications who help resource and share the news around Compass. So really, thanks to all. And that's it for this week. We'll be back with a new episode in 2 weeks' time. So I will chat at you then. In the meantime, peace.